Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was almost destroyed in one. In 390 BC, the Gauls sacked the city, leaving it in ruins. This wasn't just a setback, it was a turning point. How did Rome bounce back from near annihilation? Tonight, we'll walk through the ashes of the Gallic sack and discover how it forced Rome to reinvent itself. From new walls to a stronger army, every change was a response to failure. But here's the catch. Without this disaster, Rome might never have become an empire. Curious? Let's explore. The story says Rome was founded in a single day by twin brothers raised by a she-wolf. Romulus killed Remus, drew a line in the dirt, and called it a city. But the archaeological record tells a different story, one of gradual settlement over centuries. The truth is messier and honestly more interesting. Digs show people were living near the Tiber River as early as 3000 BC. By the 8th century BC, we've got proof of multiple separate villages on the Palatine, Capitoline, and Quirinal hills. That's several hundred years before the traditional 753 BC founding date. These weren't just random huts either. We've found remains of houses with thatched roofs, storage pits, and early fortifications. One wall on the Palatine dates to 730 to 720 BC, meaning people were marking territory long before Romulus supposedly showed up. Now about that she-wolf symbol. The famous statue? Much later. The earliest versions were probably just roadside shrines, the kind of folk religion you'd expect from herders and farmers. What's fascinating is how later Romans retroactively made it their origin story. A settlement that needed mythic roots grabbed onto the abandoned twins motif that existed in other cultures. It's nation-building 101. Take some vague legends, add drama, and suddenly you've got divine origins. Here's where it gets complicated. The Forum area started as a swampy valley between hills. By 750 to 700 BC, someone decided to drain it and build public structures, including what became the Domus Publica, the priest's official residence. That shows organization beyond just scattered villages. But was it a city yet? Not quite. More like several communities realizing it was smarter to share resources than fight over them. The Romans weren't alone in this area either. Neighboring groups like the Sabines and Etruscans influenced everything from religious practices to burial customs. You can see it in early pottery shards. Some look distinctly local, others show trade with Greek colonies. This makes sense when you realize the Tiber Ford by the Forum Boarium was essentially ancient Rome's first shopping mall, where salt, livestock, and goods changed hands. Now consider what the myths leave out. No mention of the slow merge of hilltop villages. Nothing about the Latin farmers or Sabine herders who actually lived there first. The violence gets glorified. Looking at you, rape of the Sabine women. But the boring logistical stuff, like how clans negotiated grazing rights or who maintained the earliest bridges, that gets erased. The Romans weren't alone in this area either. Neighboring groups like the Sabines and Etruscans influenced everything from religious practices to burial customs. You can see it in early pottery shards. Some look distinctly local, others show trade with Greek colonies. This makes sense when you realize the Tiber Ford by the Forum Boarium was essentially ancient Rome's first shopping mall, where salt, livestock, and goods changed hands. Now consider what the myths leave out. No mention of the slow merge of hilltop villages. Nothing about the Latin farmers or Sabine herders who actually lived there first. The violence gets glorified. Looking at you, rape of the Sabine women. But the boring logistical stuff, like how clans negotiated grazing rights or who maintained the earliest bridges, that gets erased. Does this mean the founding myths are worthless? Not at all. They reveal what later Romans valued: toughness, brotherhood, divine favor. The she-wolf story justified expansion. Hey, we're just reclaiming what our ancestor was promised. The fratricide explained political strife, if even the founders fought. These weren't history lessons. They were PR campaigns carved into the culture. What archaeology gives us is the real foundation under the legend. a place where geography forced cooperation, 7 defensible hills near a navigable river crossing, evidence of rituals blending Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan traditions, the gradual shift from family clans to something resembling civic government. It's less cinematic than Twin Brothers and Wolf Milk, but it's how civilizations actually form. So why does the gap between myth and reality matter? Because Rome's early days show how societies reinvent their past to suit the present. The handy 753 BC date let later historians mark Year 1. The dramatic stories made the mundane process of ditch digging and trade negotiations feel destined. Both the legends and the ruins are true in their own way, one showing aspiration, the other showing accumulation. One last thing about that Palatine Wall from 730 BC. It wasn't built by legendary kings, just people who needed to protect their grain stores. That's the real origin story, practical folks solving problems, not gods handing down cities. And when those scattered settlements finally joined up, well, let's just say you don't go from sheep pens to senate houses overnight. Rome didn't just happen to be where it was. Every inch of that landscape was chosen for survival. Picture the Tiber River first, not too close to the sea, but close enough. 15 miles inland meant ships could reach it, but pirates couldn't raid it easily. The river wasn't just water, it was a highway for salt, grain, and bronze. And where there's trade, there's power. Then there were the 7 hills. Not dramatic mountains, but steep enough to matter. The Palatine gave you a clear view of anyone approaching. The Capitoline? That was your panic room, a sheer cliff on one side, easy to defend. Early settlers didn't need walls here. The terrain did half the work. Marshes between the hills acted like moats, slowing down attackers. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than flat ground where anyone could walk right in. Threats were constant. Raiders from the Apennines, rival clans, even wild animals. But the hills let you see trouble coming. If someone crossed the Tiber ford, you had time to grab your spear. If enemies camped in the valley, you could roll rocks down on them. Geography wasn't just about convenience, it was about living through the night. The real genius spot was the Forum Boreum. North of the Aventine Hill, this was Rome's first shopping center. Ships docked here, avoiding the open coast. Cattle drank at the river's edge before being sold. Think of it as a Bronze Age truck stop, muddy, loud, and full of deals being made. Salt from Ostia moved upriver. Tools and pottery came down. Control this spot, and you controlled the region's economy. That ford was everything. Shallow water meant people and goods could cross without boats. No bridge needed, just walk. But that also made it dangerous. Whoever held the ford could tax traders or block armies. Later, Rome would fight wars over crossings like this. At the start, though, it was just a convenient place to meet your neighbors, whether to trade with them or stab them. Compare Rome to its neighbors. Veii had wealth but was landlocked. Ostia had ports but no defenses. Alba Longa had tradition but weak geography. Rome had it all. Hills, river, ford, and a path to the sea. It wasn't glamorous yet, but it was practical. You could fish in the Tiber, grow crops on the slopes, and still have time to ambush anyone who looked at your sheep wrong. The Capitoline Hill tells its own story. Sharp cliffs made it a natural fortress. From here, you could watch the salt route, a commodity as valuable as oil today. Control salt, and you control food preservation. Control food, and you control people. Early Romans weren't building palaces here. They were storing grain and hiding during raids. Core samples show how much the land changed. The Forum Boreum wasn't always dry. It flooded seasonally. That's why early huts were on higher ground. But those floods also left fertile soil. Smart settlers used the wet seasons for crops and the dry seasons for markets. Nothing was wasted. Not the land, not the river, not even the mud. Defense came first. The Capitoline's cliffs were your last stand. If attackers made it past the outer hills, you fell back here. Later, they'd build temples on this spot, but early on, it was just a place to throw rocks from. The other hills formed a rough circle, with marshes between them like a security system. Cross them, and you'd be exhausted by the time you reached anyone's hut. Salt made Rome rich. The Tiber carried it upstream from coastal marshes. At the ford, traders had to stop, pay, or fight. Rome didn't invent this system. Older towns had done the same. But Rome's location let it dominate the trade. By the time kings ruled, they weren't just leaders, they were salt barons. So why here? Because every other option was worse. Too far north, and you froze. Too far south, and you baked. On the coast, you got raided. Deep inland, you starved. Rome hit the sweet spot, protected but connected, tough but fertile. It wasn't an accident. It was real estate calculus with spears. The payoff came later. Those hills became neighborhoods. The ford became bridges. The salt route became taxes. But none of that mattered at first. What mattered was waking up alive. The geography gave you that chance, if you were smart enough to use it. Now, about those early villagers. They weren't Romans yet, just Latin farmers and Sabine herders trying not to die. The land forced them together, but the people made the deal. Some came willingly, others, well, that's a darker story. Early Rome wasn't a city, it was a collection of armed camps. Picture separate settlements on each hill, each controlled by a different clan. The Palatine had its group, the Quirinal another. They spoke similar languages but weren't family, more like neighbors who might help you rebuild a fence one day and steal your goats the next. These gentes ran their own show, laws, rituals, even wars. Your last name decided where you stood, literally. The clans weren't equals. Some had better land by the river. Others controlled key trade routes. The real power players were the patres, family heads who'd later become senators. They could call meetings, settle disputes, and demand loyalty. But here's the catch. No single clan could dominate the others. The hills were too close together. Raiding your neighbor meant they'd raid back tomorrow. So they developed rules. Not out of kindness, but exhaustion. Synoikismos happened because the alternative was dying. That's Greek for living together, but it was more like a hostile merger. Archaeological proof sits under the forum. Around 700 BC, someone drained the swamp between hills and paved it. Burials stopped. Suddenly, there was neutral ground, a place to meet without weapons. Not for friendship, but necessity. Traders needed markets. Farmers needed safe paths. Young men needed wives who weren't cousins. The Capitoline Hill became the glue, not just a fortress. It was where clans went to swear oaths. Early votive offerings up there date to the 7th century BC. Jupiter Feretrius got his first shrine, a god who enforced treaties. Smart move. Make the divine witness your deals, and breaking them risks more than human anger. Tribes who wouldn't trust each other would trust shared rituals. Public spaces changed everything. The forum's Domus Publica, priest's house, appears around this time. It wasn't grand, but it was permanent. A place to store records, host feasts, and judge disputes. Centralization meant someone had to sweep the floor. Literally. The first roads connected key clan territories, forcing interaction. Paths became streets. Neutral ground became law ground. Walls tell the real story. That Palatine Wall from 730 to 720 BC wasn't just defense, it was a border. Not Rome yet, but no longer random huts. Streets linked to gates suggest traffic control. Someone was directing labor, materials, and guards. Power wasn't absolute, but it was present. Archaeology calls this a more sophisticated level of social and political organization. Translation: fewer midnight massacres, more dawn negotiations. Religion fueled unity. The lapis niger, black stone in the Forum, marks one of Rome's oldest shrines. Dig beneath it, and you'll find 7th century BC offerings. Not fancy stuff, broken pottery, animal bones, but it's evidence of shared rituals. Different clans kept their household gods, but now had public ceremonies too. Sacrifice together, stay together. Convenient, since enemies were everywhere. The Latin League shows how this played out. Nearby towns like Alba Longa had similar clan systems. Rome didn't invent unity, it copied smarter neighbors. Early treaties divided spoils and set alliance terms. But Rome had the Tiber. Control that, and you're suddenly the meeting point. Hill tribes need salt, they come to you. Greek traders want inland deals, your market's the stop. Geography turned grudging cooperation into leverage. Kingship emerged from this mess. Not monarchy as we think of it, more like a rotating CEO. Early rulers probably came from big clans, their power checked by others. The title Rex might have started as a war leader, temporary. But with synoikismos, someone had to oversee shared projects. Walls don't build themselves. Courts need judges. And when the Sabines came raiding, hesitation got you killed. Here's what forced the change. Failure wasn't an option. Alone, clans were snack-sized for Etruscan armies. Together, they could bargain. The shift wasn't smooth. Clan heads resisted losing power. But by 600 BC, archaeology shows a unified city. The Rome we know starts here, not with a legendary founder, but with stubborn pragmatism. Capitoline temple foundations prove the point. Early shrines were wood and thatch. But as unity grew, so did the buildings. Permanent structures demand collective labor and taxes to pay for them. That's government in action, not from idealism, but because saying, "Your clan guards the North Wall Tuesday," beats constant ambushes. The irony? Rome's greatness came from weakness. Its location made it a target, forcing alliances. Clan rivalries created checks on power. Even the violence, like the infamous rape of the Sabines, led to uneasy mergers. Nothing was wasted, not even conflicts. Every crisis became a reason to centralize further. Which brings us to the kings. Outsiders, some of them. Etruscans who saw a patchwork town and thought, "I can run this." They weren't entirely wrong, but that's another story. One involving blood oaths, sewage systems, and how to lose a throne before breakfast. Early Rome had a problem. Too many men, not enough women. Romulus's asylum offer drew exiles and fugitives, but they were mostly male. You can't build a city with just warriors, you need families. So the Romans threw a festival, inviting the Sabines from nearby towns. Imagine the scene, food, music, then suddenly Roman hands grabbing Sabine daughters. Not a courtship ritual, more like a mass kidnapping with snacks. The rape here didn't mean what it does today. It came from raptio, meaning seizure. These women weren't assaulted, they were forcibly married, still brutal, still strategic. Take the daughters of your neighbors, and suddenly you've got mothers raising Roman children. The Sabine men, they left furious, swearing violent revenge, which they got. King Titus Tatius marched on Rome with an army. The clash happened in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. Both sides fought hard, but the turning point came when the Sabine women ran onto the battlefield, not to flee, to protest. They stood between their fathers and their new husbands, babies in arms. Some versions say they threatened to throw themselves into the fray if fighting continued. The message was clear: we're stuck here now. Make peace or orphan your grandchildren. It worked. The Sabines and Romans negotiated a merger. Titus Tatius even co-ruled with Romulus for a while, until he mysteriously died, because Roman politics never change. More importantly, the groups intermarried. Sabines became part of Rome's social fabric. Their gods blended with Roman ones. The Quirinal Hill, originally a Sabine stronghold, became a core neighborhood. Their deity, Quirinus, got folded into Rome's pantheon. This wasn't touchy-feely unity. It was cold pragmatism. Rome needed bodies, workers, wives, warriors, and absorbing neighbors solved that. Later, this became a template. Conquer a group, then offer them a stake in the system. Latin allies got partial citizenship. Etruscan nobles married into Roman families. The Sabine episode set the pattern. Violence first, integration second. The women themselves had no real choice, but the legend spins it as their initiative. Convenient, right? They begged for peace, sounds better than we trapped them between two armies. Archaeology supports some of it. Sabine artifacts show up in early Roman graves, proving cultural mixing. But the myth glosses over the ugly truth. This was demographic engineering at spear point. Did it backfire? Surprisingly, no. The merged population stabilized Rome. Sabine traditions influenced everything from military tactics, they were fierce fighters, to religion, hello Jupiter. Their hilltop villages became city districts. By the time the Etruscans showed up, Rome wasn't just a Latin town, it was a hybrid. That diversity became a strength, letting Rome absorb more groups without fracturing. The story's retold as a romantic yarn, women ending war through love. The reality was messier. These were political hostages who turned their leverage into influence. Later, Romans proudly claimed Sabine ancestry, but the early years were tense. Some Sabine families always resented the takeover. What does this say about Rome? That it would do whatever worked. Kidnap women? Sure. Merge cultures? Obviously. Rewrite history to look noble? Standard practice. The Sabine integration wasn't pretty, but it set Rome on the path to empire. Conquer, assimilate, repeat. That adaptability defined Rome's rise. Neighboring cities fought to exterminate rivals. Rome fought to absorb them. The Sabines got seats in the Senate before Rome even had a Senate. Fast forward centuries, and this ethos let Rome swallow entire civilizations whole. First Italy, then the Mediterranean. The aftermath mattered more than the abduction. Shared festivals honored the Sabine women as matrons of Rome. Their descendants would include some of Rome's greatest leaders. The violence faded, the political union endured. That's the real lesson. Rome didn't just take land, it took people and made them Roman. One last thing about those Sabine women. Their names are mostly lost. The legend glorifies their sacrifice, but they were individuals with no say in their fate. Yet they carved power where they could, brokering peace, raising families, shaping traditions. Rome called them heroes while forgetting their coercion. Classic Roman spin. Meanwhile, kingship was evolving. The Sabine merger added new factions to the power struggle. And the next rulers? They weren't even Latin. Enter the Etruscans, outsiders who saw Rome's potential and decided to run it themselves. But that's a story of temples, treachery, and indoor plumbing. Rome's third king was an outsider with big ambitions. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus wasn't even Roman, he was Etruscan. Came from Etruria up north where they'd already built proper cities, while Rome was still figuring out how to pave roads. The story says he arrived in Rome with his wife Tanaquil after leaving his hometown. His wealth and connections got him noticed, but his Etruscan background made some Romans uneasy. Still, they made him king around 616 BC. That tells you something about early Rome. It would take talent wherever it could get it. The Etruscans knew how to build cities that lasted. Tarquinius got to work transforming Rome from a collection of huts into something resembling a proper urban center. His first big project was draining the swampy areas between the hills. The Cloaca Maxima started as an open ditch, but eventually became Rome's underground sewer system. This wasn't just about sanitation. It reclaimed usable land for markets and public buildings. The engineering wasn't Roman. The Etruscans understood hydraulics and construction techniques the Latins hadn't mastered yet. That big stone arch they used? Etruscan design. Politics changed under Etruscan rule too. Tarquinius expanded the Senate from 100 to 300 members. On paper, this looked democratic. In practice, he packed it with allies. Some were fellow Etruscans, others local elites he'd won over. The old Roman families weren't thrilled. Imagine being a Latin clan leader watching outsiders take the best seats in government. But the king understood power. Keep potential rivals busy debating while you make the real decisions. The Circus Maximus was another Etruscan import. Started as a simple track for chariot races, it became Rome's first major entertainment venue. The Etruscans loved public spectacles, races, boxing, religious processions. Tarquinius brought that culture south. These weren't just games, they were power displays. Gather thousands in one place, feed them, distract them, and they're less likely to revolt. The circus also drained manpower. Maintaining it required laborers permanently employed by the state. More dependence on the king. Architecture got an upgrade too. Early Roman temples were basic wooden structures. The Etruscans built proper stone foundations with terracotta decorations. They introduced the tripartite temple design, 3 rooms for 3 chief gods, soon adapted for Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva on the Capitoline. These weren't just buildings, they were statements. A city with proper temples looked legitimate to traders and visiting diplomats, the Temple of Jupiter. Optimus Maximus became Rome's religious center because the Etruscans knew how to make it impressive. Fashion and symbols changed under Etruscan influence. The toga, originally an Etruscan garment. The fasces, those bundles of rods and axes carried by magistrates. Etruscan symbols of authority. Even Rome's alphabet came via the Etruscans, who'd adapted it from Greek traders. The kings adopted Etruscan regalia too, the golden crown, ivory throne, purple robes, all designed to impress and intimidate. Some Romans loved the sophistication, others saw cultural takeover. Military tactics evolved with Etruscan knowledge. They introduced the hoplite phalanx, tight infantry formations with overlapping shields. Better armor too, bronze breastplates instead of leather. Rome's army became more disciplined, more lethal. The downside, Etruscan kings used it to expand their personal power, conquering neighboring towns to fund more construction projects. Some Romans fought in these campaigns, others resented the endless wars for a foreign king's glory. Commerce flourished under the Etruscans. They expanded trade routes north to the Po Valley and south to Greek colonies. Roman merchants picked up better business practices, contracts, accounting methods, even early banking. The Forum became a proper marketplace under Etruscan oversight. Taxes got more systematic too. Tarquinius allegedly introduced the census. Count the people, know who can pay. Efficiency has its price. But oppression grew alongside progress. The Etruscan kings ruled firmly, sometimes brutally. Tarquinius allegedly had opponents executed without trials. Public works required forced labor, often from conquered peoples. The Senate's expansion diluted old families' power. Resentment festered among native Romans, watching their city transform under foreign hands. Yet the projects kept coming. Better roads, expanded fortifications, grander temples. The kings gambled that impressive results would justify their methods. Religion blended Roman and Etruscan practices too. The Etruscans were obsessed with divination, reading omens in lightning strikes or bird flights. Roman priests adopted these techniques, though they gave them Latin names. The concept of templum, sacred space precisely aligned with cosmic directions, came from Etruria. Even the idea of deifying rulers had Etruscan roots. The kings encouraged this. Blurring divine and royal authority helped their rule. What's fascinating is how much Rome kept after the Etruscans left. The sewer system kept working. The circus kept hosting games. The military tactics kept winning battles. The blending wasn't smooth. There were always tensions between adopted innovations and native traditions. But Etruscan rule proved Rome could absorb foreign ideas without losing itself. That adaptability became its greatest strength. The kings didn't last, though. Arrogance undid them. Tarquinius's successor, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, pushed too hard. Too many wars, too much taxation, too little respect for Roman customs. After 44 years of Etruscan kings, the Romans had enough. But they kept the infrastructure, the institutions, even some of the ceremonies. The revolution that came next wasn't about erasing Etruscan influence, just controlling it. Because by then, much of what made Rome impressive was thanks to those foreign rulers. The next chapter wouldn't be about kings at all, but about a radical new idea called the Republic. The last king of Rome pushed too far. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus ruled like he owned the city, because technically, he thought he did. No elections, no Senate approval, just executions for anyone who questioned him. His bodyguards carried axes bound in rods, the fasces symbol that meant, "Cross me and lose your head." He drained the treasury for his temples, drafted men for endless wars, and let his sons run wild. One of them, Sextus, would be the spark that burned the monarchy down. It started with a dinner party at Calatia. Sextus Tarquinius was guest in Lucretia's home while her husband served in the army. Their house wasn't some hut. Marble floors, painted walls, the works. Fine dining, drinking. Then Sextus slipped back later that night with a dagger. What happened next became legend. The rape, Lucretia gathering her family the next morning, stabbing herself in the heart. But the real shock was Brutus, the king's own nephew, pulling the knife from her chest and swearing revenge. The knife became the revolution's symbol. Brutus wasn't some backwoods rebel. He'd played the fool for years, letting the royals underestimate him while building connections. Now he marched to the forum with Lucretia's body on display, turning private grief into public fury. Farmers dropped plows. Blacksmiths made swords instead of horseshoes. Even Tarquin's palace guards hesitated when armed citizens surrounded the compound. The king fled north to Etruria, expecting loyal troops to crush the revolt. None came. What replaced monarchy wasn't democracy as we know it, more like damage control. The first thing Brutus did was make every senator swear an oath never to allow kings again. They sealed it by throwing Tarquin's personal treasures into the Tiber: gold cups, embroidered robes, even his favorite throne. Archaeologists still find bits of Etruscan metalwork in river mud near Ponte Sublizio. Then came the new rules. 2 consuls instead of 1 king, elected yearly. Both could veto each other. Want to start a war? Need approval from the Senate first. Feel like executing someone? Hold a trial. The magistrates kept pieces of royal power but chopped them up. Consuls got the fasces, but only outside city limits. Inside Rome, no axes, just rods for minor punishments. The old king's religious duties got split between pontiffs and augurs. Even military command rotated so no general could build a personal army. Suspicion became government policy. Term limits, divided authority, mandatory audits. Did it work? Barely. The first years were shaky. Tarquin kept trying to retake Rome, once with Veï's army, another time with his Etruscan relatives. Brutus died fighting his own son when the kid joined the royalists. Some senators whispered about bringing back monarchy just until things stabilize. But the system held because fear kept everyone honest. Patricians policed each other, knowing one power grab would spark 40 rivals to take them down. The citizen militia became the Republic's backbone. Every landowner had to serve when called, bringing their own weapons. No professional army meant no general could coup the government, but it also meant farmers might abandon harvest to fight Sabines. Early records show desperate laws. If your field's unattended because of duty, neighbors must tend it or face fines. Defense wasn't just a job, it was everyone's problem. Class tensions simmered beneath. Patricians ran the show, but plebeians did the bleeding in battles. By 494 BCE, this boiled over into the first plebeian strike. They marched out to the Aventine Hill, refusing to fight until given more rights. The result? New officials called tribunes who could veto any law-harming commoners. More checks, more voices at the table. Crisis kept forcing compromise. Foreign policy got ruthless fast. The infant republic couldn't afford weakness. When Latin cities hesitated to renew alliances, Rome burned their fields until they complied. Enemy leaders got paraded in triumph, then strangled if they looked troublesome. Garrisons planted on conquered land became colonies, part military base, part loyalty enforcement. The Lucretia story got polished over time. Later writers made her the perfect Roman matron, chaste, devoted, inspiring. Reality was messier. Ancient sources hint she might have been collateral in a larger power struggle between clans. But the Republic needed founding myths cleaner than its actual birth. Better to remember a heroine than admit nobles mostly feared another king grabbing their estates. What emerged wasn't some ideal government, just a workable one. Flaws and all, it lasted longer than any democracy in history, until generals with personal armies got too big to control. But that's centuries ahead. In 509 BCE, all Rome knew was this: no single man would rule them again. Or so they hoped. Now came the hard part, keeping neighboring kings from smothering their experiment. Veii and the Etruscans hadn't gone anywhere. Surviving meant convincing them this wasn't a weak moment, but a new kind of threat. Instead of one tyrant, they'd face a whole city armed and angry. Rome's first real test as a republic came from just 12 miles away. Veii wasn't some backwater village. It was a wealthy Etruscan city with better walls, richer temples, and a serious grudge. Picture two rivals sharing a fence line, each waiting for the other to blink. Both claimed the same salt routes and river crossings. Both remembered when Etruscan kings ruled Rome. The difference? Veii still had kings, and they wanted their Roman subjects back. For 40 years, it was a stalemate. Seasonal raids, burned crops, the occasional skirmish. Roman farmers would march out each spring, clash with Veientine troops near the Tiber River, then go home for harvest. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Then came 406 BCE. Rome finally committed. No more seasonal warfare. They built winter quarters outside Veii's walls. For the first time, Roman soldiers stayed in the field year-round. That required new logistics, supply trains, paid troops, siege engines. The Republic had to invent siege warfare as it went. The terrain favored Veii. Their city sat on a plateau with steep cliffs on 3 sides. Underground tunnels brought fresh water during blockades. Breaking in required more than frontal assaults. The Romans built encircling earthworks, miles of trenches and palisades to starve the city out. Workers raised siege towers on wheels while sappers dug mines underneath the walls. It still wasn't enough. 10 years passed. Back in Rome, politicians argued over the cost while soldiers rotated home just to replant their neglected fields. Enter Camillus. Elected dictator in 396 BCE, he changed the game. First, he adjusted the tax code so wealthy citizens funded the war effort directly. Then he issued the army's first regular pay, 3 bronze asses per day. Suddenly, Rome could keep professionals in the field instead of relying on farmer soldiers. His masterstroke came underground. While Veii watched the siege towers, Roman sappers dug a narrow tunnel beneath the Temple of Juno. On the final assault, they burst up inside the city like sewer rats with swords. The shock worked. Veii's defenders panicked, and Camillus's troops opened the gates from within. What followed wasn't pretty. The 10-year siege had built up rage. Roman soldiers sacked Veii for days. Temples were looted, citizens enslaved. Even the city's patron goddess Juno was convinced to relocate to Rome. Camillus rode through the streets in a 4-horse chariot like some triumphant king, a sight that made Republican senators uneasy. But the message was clear. Rome could dismantle its enemies block by block. The psychological impact mattered more than territory. For generations, Veii had been the bigger brother, richer, more cultured, more powerful. Now its gold-lined Roman coffers. The land grab was substantial too. Rome annexed Veii's territory, creating 4 new voting tribes. Suddenly, thousands of new citizens and voters entered the system. Military service obligations expanded accordingly. Conquest wasn't just about glory anymore. It fueled the Republic's machinery. Siege tech evolved too. Those tunnels at Veii became standard procedure. Later, Roman armies would replicate them at Syracuse, Carthage, Jerusalem. The concept of paid soldiers, that stuck around. So did tactical patience. After Veii, Rome understood some victories required decades, not seasons. Regional powers took notice. Latin allies who'd hesitated to pick sides now paid tribute. Etruscan cities south of the Tiber became cautious. Rome wasn't just another hill town anymore. Integration proved thorny. Many Veientines got Roman citizenship, but resentment lingered. Some elite families bribed their way into the Senate, causing grumbling among old patrician houses. Others clung to Etruscan customs, creating cultural friction. The new voting tribes diluted established power structures. Conquest was messy, but Rome was learning how to digest its meals. The costs added up. Decades of war exhausted Rome's manpower. Fields lay fallow as farmers turned soldiers died in ditch-digging accidents or dysentery outbreaks. The treasury, flush with Veii's gold at first, soon bled dry, paying for reconstruction and garrison troops. Worst of all, success bred arrogance. When the nearby town of Falerii rebelled, Rome crushed it without thinking, burning crops, executing leaders. Allies started wondering if they'd traded one bully for another. Camillus became a problem too. His triumph at Veii went to his head. He demanded honors beyond republican norms, even suggesting his siege veterans receive land grants from conquered territory. Senators who'd cheered his victories now whispered about ambition. When he opposed redistributing Veii's land to poor citizens, his popularity tanked. Soon enough, they found an excuse to exile him, alleged embezzlement of plunder. Rome wanted heroes, but not potential kings. Veii's fall created a power vacuum. Without their Etruscan rival blocking the north, Rome faced new enemies: Aequians, Volscians, even distant Gauls sniffing around the Tiber Valley. The Republic had barely finished celebrating when reports came of Celtic war bands crossing the Apennines. Farmers along the Via Salaria spotted torches in the hills. Rome had crushed one threat only to face something far worse: migrants with no cities to besiege and no interest in playing by Roman rules. The Gauls weren't like Veii. They didn't build walls worth tunneling under. They didn't care about Juno or treaties. And unlike the Etruscans, they weren't impressed by marble temples or gold-stuffed treasuries. What they wanted was simple: everything Rome had, taken as fast as possible. In 390 BCE, that's exactly what they came for. Burnt earth policy? The Gauls invented it. Psychological warfare? Their battle chants alone made veterans soil themselves. Rome was about to learn the hard way that some enemies can't be out-engineered. Rome's worst nightmare arrived on July 18th, 390 BCE. That's the date historians give for the Battle of the Allia, where Brennus and his Senioni Gauls crushed Rome's army. These weren't the organized Etruscans Rome had fought before. The Gauls came howling down from the north, tall, long-haired warriors who fought naked save for torques around their necks. They didn't bother with siege tactics or negotiations. The Roman militia, used to orderly clashes along the Tiber, broke instantly when the Gauls charged. The road to Rome stood open. Most citizens fled, but some senators remained. Old men in their ceremonial robes sat motionless in the forum as Gauls wandered through the city, looting temples and burning houses. The Capitol Hill held out. Its cliffs were too steep for the invaders to scale easily. A small garrison up there became Rome's last defense. Legend says geese sacred to Juno alerted them when Gauls tried a night attack. Whether true or not, the symbolism mattered. Even the gods seemed to draw a line at that hill. For 7 months, the Gauls occupied Rome. They weren't settlers, just opportunistic looters. When hunger and disease became problems, Brennus offered a deal. Pay us enough gold, and we'll leave. The Romans assembled what treasure remained, hauling it to the agreed meeting spot. But when Brennus's men weighed the gold, the Romans protested the scales were rigged. That's when Brennus threw his sword onto the balance with the famous words, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. It wasn't just a taunt. It was the entire power dynamic summed up in 2 words. Rome paid about 1,000 pounds of gold to see the Gauls leave. The humiliation cut deep. Militarily, the disaster exposed every weakness. The citizen militia system collapsed when faced with professional warriors. Rome's loose alliance network failed. No Latin cities came to help. Even the geography that had protected Rome for centuries proved useless against an enemy that didn't care about controlling territory, just taking what they could carry. But here's where it gets interesting. This catastrophe became Rome's turning point. The survivors didn't just rebuild, they reinvented. First priority, walls. The Servian wall project began almost immediately, a massive defensive circuit surrounding all 7 hills, no more relying on natural barriers alone. This wasn't subtle architecture, just thick stone meant to withstand anything. Parts of it still stand today near Termini Station. The military got overhauled too. Camillus, the same general who'd conquered Veii, returned from exile to lead reforms. Out went the loose militia bands. In came standardized equipment, the scutum shield, pilum javelins, gladius swords. Soldiers trained together instead of showing up when called. Most importantly, they got paid, 3 bronze asses a day, creating Rome's first semi-professional army. Political changes followed. The Latin League tightened its alliances, making mutual defense obligations clearer. Colonies became more than just settlements. They were forward bases manned by veteran soldiers. Even Rome's social structure shifted. The trauma bonded patricians and plebeians together against external threats. Debates about land redistribution paused while everyone focused on survival. The Gauls left scars beyond the physical damage. Roman writers returned to this event for centuries whenever they needed a cautionary tale. Remember the Gauls became shorthand for staying vigilant. Annual commemorations honored the dead from the Allia disaster. Generals later used Gallic fears to justify preemptive strikes across the Alps. The trauma became part of Rome's identity, a people who'd touched bottom and sworn never to go back. Some myths grew from the ashes. The story about the geese saving the capital, probably exaggerated. But it served a purpose, reinforcing that even in disaster, Rome had divine favor. The Gauls hadn't fully conquered them. Similarly, tales of Camillus arriving with an army to chase off Brennus likely inflated his role. The truth was messier. Rome bought its freedom, then rebuilt slowly. Archaeology confirms parts of the story. Burn layers in forum excavations date to this period. but there's no evidence the entire city was destroyed, more like targeted looting of rich areas. The Gauls wanted portable wealth, not real estate. This wasn't genocide. It was a brutal shakedown that exposed systemic flaws. What's striking is how Rome reacted. Other cities might have collapsed or sought a strongman to protect them. Instead, Rome doubled down on republican systems while making them more effective. The checks and balances remained, but now with teeth. It's as if they understood that survival required both flexibility and rigid discipline, a paradox they'd master over centuries. The Gauls became Rome's boogeyman. Even after the wall was built, any rumor of Celtic movement sent shivers through the city. Later, historians would claim the Gauls laughed at Rome's small size when they first saw it. Maybe true, maybe not. But the punchline is history. That same unimpressive city would eventually conquer the Gauls' entire territory. Revenge took generations, but Rome never forgot the lesson. Weakness invites predators. One final note about that ransom gold. Ancient sources claim Camillus eventually recovered it after defeating the Gauls in later battles. Likely propaganda, but telling. Rome couldn't erase the humiliation, but they could rewrite the ending. The metal itself didn't matter. It was about proving they weren't permanently beaten. Now came the real work. With walls rising and armies retraining, Rome faced a question. Would these changes stick when the crisis faded? Or would complacency creep back in? The answers would determine whether 390 BCE was just a bad memory or the birth of something tougher. The Gallic sack left Rome with one clear lesson: never again. Those burned temples and looted homes showed what happened when you relied on hills and luck for defense. So they built something that couldn't be scaled or bribed: the Servian Wall. 11 feet thick in places, 30 feet high, stretching over 7 miles around the city's core. Not just a barrier, a statement. Funding it was the first hurdle. The treasury was still refilling after paying off Brennus. Taxes went up, especially on landowners whose estates had survived the sack. Some senators grumbled about costs until Camillus pointed out how much more expensive another invasion would be. They settled on a mix of state funds, war spoils, and forced labor from conquered towns. Every able-bodied citizen likely worked shifts, hauling tufa blocks from quarries near Veii. Construction followed the natural contours of Rome's 7 hills, but didn't just trace old village boundaries. Engineers extended the wall to include key approaches where Gauls had broken through. The weakest spots got extra reinforcement: double walls at the Colline Gate, deeper foundations along the Esquiline where the land was flatter. They recycled materials too: stones from demolished Etruscan tombs, even chunks of Veii's walls. Nothing went to waste. The design was practical, not pretty. No decorative carvings, just alternating layers of tufa and softer Capellaccio stone for stability. Every few hundred feet, square towers jutted out so defenders could rain javelins down on attackers trying to scale the base. Gates were narrow choke points with heavy oak doors reinforced with iron. Outside the wall, workers dug a defensive ditch 20 feet wide. Not deep enough to stop an army, but enough to slow one down while archers took aim. Urban development shifted around this new perimeter. Wealthy families who'd built villas on the outskirts suddenly found their land incorporated into the defensive zone. Some got compensated. Others were told it was their civic duty. Temples and markets clustered closer to the center now, protected by the wall's embrace. The old Forum Boarium, once right by the river, got new warehouses inside the defenses. Rome stopped being a collection of hill communities and became a single fortified unit. Psychologically, the wall changed everything. Farmers who'd hesitated to return after the sack now replanted fields, knowing they could retreat behind stone if Gauls reappeared. Merchants stored more goods in the city instead of dispersing them to countryside villas. Even the calendar reflected the new mindset. July 18th, the anniversary of the Aliyah disaster, became a day of public mourning and military drills. The wall wasn't just physical security, it was collective therapy in stone. Did it work? Mostly. Later Gallic raids in 367 and 349 BCE found a very different Rome. Attackers who expected to waltz in as Brennus had were met with locked gates and prepared defenders. The wall forced enemies to either commit to lengthy sieges, which roaming warbands weren't equipped for, or go home empty-handed. It also gave Rome's new professional army time to mobilize. No more scrambling to defend the capital as an afterthought. But walls have limits. They didn't stop the Samnites from raiding nearby farms in the 320s BCE. They couldn't prevent disease outbreaks when refugees crowded inside during crises, and they created a false sense of invincibility. Some politicians started arguing Rome didn't need strong allies since it had impenetrable defenses. That arrogance would cause problems later. The Servian Wall's real legacy was making Rome think differently about space. For the first time, there was a clear inside and outside. Citizenship meant something tangible when you passed through those gates. Military service wasn't just about defending your clan's hill, it was protecting the entire urban organism. Even the Latin word for city, urbs, took on new weight once it had defined edges. Maintenance became a permanent civic duty. Every spring, teams inspected the wall for cracks or erosion. Special magistrates oversaw repairs, funded by fines from corrupt officials, a nice bit of poetic justice. Over time, the wall became less about the Gauls and more about Roman identity. You could stand on it and see both the city's heart and its expanding territory. It was a daily reminder of how far they'd come since that humiliation in 390 BCE. Yet for all its strengths, the wall had one flaw. It assumed Rome would always be the defender. The city's growing ambitions meant future wars would be fought far beyond these stones. What good was a static defense when your armies were campaigning in Campania or Sicily? The wall bought time for Rome to rebuild its military, but soon that military would outgrow the very defenses that made its rebirth possible. Camillus understood this. Even as he championed the wall's construction, he pushed for offensive reforms, better weapons, standardized training, paid soldiers who could campaign year-round. The wall was a shield, but Rome needed swords too, and those swords would soon be tested against enemies who didn't just raid, but built empires of their own. The next threat wouldn't come from the northern hills where the Gauls lurked. It would emerge from the sea, where a merchant empire was turning into a military powerhouse. Carthage had been watching Rome's recovery with interest and concern. But that's a story for another firelight chat. For now, picture those massive grey stones under a setting sun, and the sentries walking their lengths, watching both the horizon and the city behind them. Rome was safe, for the moment. Rome's militia system had failed catastrophically against the Gauls. Farmers with spears couldn't stop professional warriors. Camillus knew this had to change. The new army wouldn't be called up seasonally. It needed to fight year-round. But first, they had to solve the funding problem. Romans hated taxes almost as much as they hated Gauls, so Camillus got creative. Wealthy citizens funded equipment in exchange for political favors. War spoils filled coffers. Soldiers got paid 3 bronze asses a day, enough to keep them fed while their fields lay fallow. The old phalanx was scrapped, too rigid for uneven Italian terrain. Instead, legions organized into maniples, 120-men units that could operate independently. Picture a checkerboard formation where each square could pivot, advance, or retreat as needed. This wasn't just Janju innovation, it was cultural. Roman flexibility beating Greek-style rigidity. Front lines rotated fresh troops during battles, wearing enemies down through endurance rather than single clashes. Standardization changed everything. Every soldier got identical gear, scutum shields layered with linen and leather, pila javelins with pyramid-shaped tips to punch through armor, gladius duan swords balanced for stabbing in close quarters. The state supplied this now, ending the patchwork of family heirlooms farmers once brought to war. Armor evolved too. Bronze chest plates gave way to chainmail copied from Gauls themselves. Rome learned from its enemies even while hating them. Training shifted from occasional drills to systematic preparation. Recruits practiced with wooden swords twice the weight of real ones to build muscle memory. Mock battles in the Campus Martius became weekly events. Discipline turned brutal. Decimation for cowardice meant beating every 10th man in a fleeing unit to death. Harsh? Absolutely. Effective? The record shows it worked. The real genius lay in the command structure. Instead of one general making all decisions, officers called centurions led individual maniples. Promotion came through merit, not birth. A plebeian who showed courage could rise to centurion, changing his family's status permanently. This gave every soldier skin in the game. Fight well, move up. Contrast that with Greek city-states where only aristocrats held command. Logistics became a science. Each legion traveled with mule trains carrying 15 days' rations, wheat, salted pork, vinegar for water purification. Engineers marched with the army to build forts every night. Medical corps followed with linen bandages and opium for pain. Rome wasn't just fielding fighters, it was creating a self-sufficient war machine. Cultural resistance nearly derailed the reforms. Old patricians grumbled about the costs. Small farmers didn't want to be away from their land for years. Camillus compromised by promising conquered territories to veterans. Land for service became the deal. This incidentally created loyal colonies in strategic areas, killing two birds with one gladius. The first test came against the Volsci in 389 BCE. Rome's new legions didn't just win, they adapted mid-battle. When the Volsci crowded a narrow pass, maniples split to climb surrounding hills and attack from multiple angles. Enemy forces expecting a straight clash panicked at the coordinated chaos. Word spread quickly through Italy. Rome fought differently now. Siege warfare improved too. Engineers who'd worked on the Servian wall applied those skills to enemy fortifications. Mobile siege towers rolled up to city walls while sappers dug tunnels underneath. Artillery crews launched stone projectiles from newly invented ballistae. War became technical, professional, and most importantly, winnable through preparation rather than brute force. Pay scales revealed the system's sophistication. Legionaries earned base pay, but bonuses came for exceptional service, extra shares of plunder, public honors, even early retirement plots. Meanwhile, penalties ensured loyalty. Deserters faced crucifixion. Theft from comrades meant stoning. Rome balanced carrot and stick with chilling efficiency. Equipment maintenance became ritualized. Soldiers oiled leather straps nightly, sharpened blades after every use, and repaired shield edges with heated metal patches. Inspections happened weekly. A rusty gladius could get you fined. A neglected scutum might mean latrine duty for a month. The message was clear. Your gear kept you alive. Respect it. Medical advances followed the reforms. Field hospitals appeared behind battle lines where wounded got priority treatment. Doctors standardized wound cleaning with vinegar and wine. Even simple innovations mattered. Each soldier carried 2 wooden stakes, not just for camp walls, but as emergency stretcher poles for carrying injured comrades. The changes seeped into civilian life too. armorers and weaponsmiths became permanent fixtures in the Forum Boreum. Leather workshops switched from farm implements to military belts and saddles. Roads improved to move legions faster. Rome's entire economy bent towards supporting this new war machine. Critics warned about militarization. Greek diplomats wrote home about how every Roman conversation eventually turned to battles and tactics. Indeed, the Forum's new bronze statues featured not philosophers or athletes, but generals and victorious soldiers. The Republic was becoming something new, a society organized around perpetual preparedness. By 350 BCE, the system had proven itself. Latin allies adopted similar structures under Roman guidance. Etruscan cities quietly upgraded their own forces in response. Even the Gauls, when they returned for another raid, found themselves outmaneuvered by disciplined maniples rather than terrified militias. But the ultimate test loomed south. A rising power noticed Rome's transformation and began adjusting its own strategies. Carthage's merchants were taking notes. Soon they'd send more than trading ships across the Mediterranean. But that's a story for when the fire burns lower and the wine flows slower. For now, picture those new legions marching beyond the Servian wall, their hobnailed sandals kicking up dust on roads that would one day stretch to Britain and Syria. Rome had rebuilt its army. Next, it would rebuild the world. After the Gallic disaster, Rome faced a hard truth. It couldn't stand alone. The city had walls now, but walls don't stop multiple enemies at once. Neighboring tribes smelled blood in the water. Equians raiding from the east, Volscians testing southern borders, and Gauls still lurking beyond the Tiber. Something had to give. So Rome did the unthinkable. It reached out to old rivals. The Latin cities it had fought for generations were now potential allies. Survival required swallowing pride. The Latin League wasn't new, but Rome's approach was. Earlier versions had been loose alliances that fell apart under pressure. This time, the treaty terms were specific. Each city pledged troops, a set number per 1,000 citizens. Shared defense meant if Aricia got attacked, Rome sent soldiers, and vice versa. No more waiting to see who'd benefit before helping. The real kicker? Command rotated, but Rome always supplied the largest contingent. Convenient that. Trust didn't come easy. Lanuvium and Tiber remembered Rome burning their fields. Romans hadn't forgotten Sabine raids. The negotiations dragged on for months, with plenty of fistfights between delegates. The final agreement included ritual sacrifices at the temple of Jupiter Latiaris, a way to bind the oath with divine consequences. Every year after, leaders reconvened there to renew the pact. The site was neutral ground, halfway between Rome and the others. The military details were brutally precise. Each city's troops had to arrive within 15 days of a call. They'd serve under a single commander, usually Roman. Supplies got divided by population. Velitrae provided barley. Tusculum brought arrows. Praeneste furnished wagons. The system mimicked Rome's own military reforms. Standardization defeated chaos. Rome even trained allied officers in the maniple system, ensuring everyone fought the same way. Rome positioned itself as first among equals. It kept veto power over league decisions, but let smaller cities handle local disputes. The treasury stayed decentralized. No one trusted Rome with their gold yet. But war spoils? Those got split, with Rome taking the largest share, officially to cover administrative costs. The Latin cities grumbled but accepted it. Better a predictable cut for Rome than losing everything to Gauls. The balance was delicate. Rome needed the League strong enough to deter invaders, but not so strong it could rebel. The solution? Colonies. When land was conquered, Rome settled veterans in strategic spots, half Roman, half Latin. These towns became League members, but answered to Rome first. It was empire building in slow motion. By 370 BCE, colonies like Sutrium and Nepet formed a defensive ring around Latium. The League's first test came when Volscians attacked Corioli in 367 BCE. Rome mobilized faster than anyone expected. 4 Latin cities sent troops on time. 2 were late and got fined. The combined forces didn't just defend, they counterattacked, stripping the Volscians of territory. The League divided the conquered land, with Rome keeping the lion's share. A pattern emerged: defend together, conquer together, profit unequally. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Smaller cities noticed Rome always seemed to benefit most. When Gabii objected to troop quotas in 358 BCE, Rome cut off its salt supply, a brutal move since salt preserved food. The message was clear: cooperation had teeth. Yet the League held because the alternatives were worse. Alone, any Latin city was prey. Together, they started becoming predators. Diplomacy stretched beyond Latium. Rome used the League's strength to negotiate with Etruscans and Samnites. When Tiber tried making separate peace with the Equians, Rome threatened to expel it from the League. Isolation meant death, so Tiber fell back in line. By 350 BCE, the League wasn't just defending, it was expanding. Latin soldiers fought in Campania, securing trade routes that enriched everyone, mostly Rome. The security network had unexpected benefits. Merchants traveled safer roads with League guards. Grain could move between cities during shortages. Rome even established joint courts to settle cross-border disputes. The Latin language started standardizing too, with Rome's dialect becoming dominant. Cultural blending happened without anyone planning it. But Rome always kept an edge. Its colonies had the best land. Its generals commanded most campaigns. When the Hernisi tribe asked to join the League, Rome dictated the terms. They'd get half the rights of full members. The League was becoming a hierarchy with Rome at the top. Cracks appeared by 340 BCE. Wealthy Latin cities like Praeneste resented playing second fiddle. Rome's insistence on leading every major campaign rankled. The shared identity that held the League together started fraying as Rome's power grew. Everyone knew this couldn't last. The only question was when it would break. For now, though, the system worked. Rome had gone from near annihilation to regional powerhouse in 2 generations. The League provided cover to rebuild, then expand. But alliances between unequals always have expiration dates. Rome was outgrowing its partners, and the Latin cities were noticing. Meanwhile, south of Latium, the Samnites watched these developments closely. Their mountain tribes had beaten the League before. Now they saw an opportunity: exploit the growing tensions, peel away discontented members. Rome's web of alliances was about to face its greatest challenge, but that's a story of betrayals, mountain ambushes, and the moment Rome stopped pretending to be just another Latin city. Rome's expansion came with a problem: how to hold territory without stretching the army too thin. The solution was colonies, but these weren't just settlements. They were military outposts disguised as towns. Picture a grid of streets laid over conquered land, populated by retired soldiers who knew how to fight. The first proper colony was Ostia, established around 350 BCE to guard the Tiber's mouth. It started as a garrison town where veterans got small plots in exchange for keeping watch for pirates. Hill tribes like the Equians and Volscians kept probing Rome's borders. Sending legions every time was exhausting and expensive. Colonies changed the game. Places like Antium and Tarracina sat along invasion routes, giving Rome early warnings. If raiders appeared, colonists would light signal fires while barricading their sturdy walls. By the time enemies reached Roman territory, reinforcements were already marching. Land distribution kept the system running. A typical colonist received about 2 jugera of land, roughly half an acre. Not enough to get rich, but enough to feed a family if worked hard. The best plots went to retired centurions, who became local leaders. Rome knew a veteran with dirt under his fingernails was less likely to rebel than one with nothing. Over time, these parcels became hereditary, tying families permanently to Rome's interests. Building these towns followed a strict template. Surveyors laid out streets in a grid pattern centered on a forum. Walls went up first, then watchtowers. Barracks doubled as housing until proper homes could be built. Everything served defense. Even the roads were designed to move troops quickly. The formula worked so well that later colonies like Ariminum and Brundisium used identical plans. Cultural clashes were inevitable. When Rome planted a colony at Fidenae, the local Etruscans weren't thrilled. Newcomers worshipped different gods, spoke Latin instead of Etruscan, and answered to Roman magistrates. Some integration happened naturally. Marriages between colonists and locals, shared market days. Other times, Rome enforced assimilation. Children in colonies learned Latin first. Local temples had to add Jupiter and Mars alongside native deities. The roads connected everything. Via Appia, started in 312 BCE, linked colonies back to Rome. Pack animals could move 25 miles a day on these stone-paved paths, fast enough for urgent messages or troop movements. Rest stops every 10 to 12 miles let travelers swap exhausted mules for fresh ones. What looked like commerce infrastructure was really a military supply line in disguise. Veteran colonies had hidden benefits. Retired soldiers made excellent drill instructors when new recruits were needed. Their presence deterred slave revolts. No one wanted to face men who'd fought Gauls. And since colonists owed their land to Rome, they voted as Rome suggested. Over generations, these settlements became political anchors, guaranteeing loyal tribes in regional assemblies. Not all colonists were enthusiastic. Some missed Rome's amenities, proper baths, theaters, diverse markets. Letters from early settlers complain about backwater conditions and unruly locals. To ease discontent, Rome shipped basic comforts: olive oil, wine, even pre-made roof tiles. More cynical observers noted that unhappy colonists made fewer demands on the treasury. The system's real test came during the Latin War in 340 BCE. When several Latin cities rebelled, colonies like Setia and Norba held firm. Their walls withstood sieges, while their garrisons harassed enemy supply lines. Most importantly, they didn't join the revolt, a vindication of Rome's land grant strategy. Veterans who might have sympathized with rebellious Latins chose to protect their own farms instead. Road maintenance became a colonial duty. Each town was responsible for keeping its section of highway in repair. This saved Rome money while giving colonists pride in the infrastructure. It also created jobs: quarry workers, stonemasons, surveyors. A veteran could retire from fighting and still serve Rome by supervising road crews. Religious practices helped bonding. Colonies built shrines to Rome's gods, but also absorbed local cults. The Temple of Diana at Aricia became a gathering place for Romans and Latins alike. Shared festivals eased tensions. It's harder to hate neighbors who bring good wine to your harvest celebration. Economics reinforced loyalty. Colonial farms fed Rome during shortages. In return, Rome bought their surpluses at fixed prices. Artisans in the colonies produced armor and weapons for the army. This wasn't charity, it was mutual self-interest disguised as patriotism. By 300 BCE, about 30,000 Romans lived in colonies across central Italy. Each town was a piece of Rome transplanted. Same laws, same military drills, same calendar of festivals. Their children grew up considering themselves Roman, even if they'd never seen the Forum. When census takers came through, these colonists listed their origin as Rome, not the local tribe. The security benefits multiplied over time. New colonies protected older ones, allowing Rome to push frontiers outward. Cisalpine Gaul got colonies like Placentia and Cremona, which then guarded routes to newer settlements in Hispania. It was empire building by real estate. Each parcel of granted land purchased another layer of buffer space. Citizenship became the glue holding it together. First-generation colonists kept full Roman rights. Their children inherited this status, tying them to Rome rather than local powers. As colonies grew, Rome selectively granted partial citizenship to nearby towns, just enough privileges to make rebellion seem foolish. Meanwhile, back in Rome, politicians were refining citizenship into something more powerful than weapons. It could be given, withheld, or modified to suit circumstances. This legal tool would eventually conquer more territory than legions ever could. But that's a story of scrolls and seals, not swords and shields. Early Romans had an inferiority complex when it came to origin stories. Their actual beginnings as a bunch of scrappy hill tribes didn't exactly scream destined for empire. Meanwhile, the Greeks had Homer's epic poems full of gods and heroes. So Rome did what any ambitious upstart would do. They borrowed a Greek hero and claimed him as their own. Enter Aeneas, the Trojan refugee who supposedly founded their bloodline. The Aeneas story didn't pop up overnight. It evolved over centuries as Rome grew more powerful. In the 300s BC, after the Gauls sacked Rome, there was suddenly a pressing need to explain who they really were. Greeks had Achilles. Romans needed their own Bronze Age champion. Aeneas was perfect, a Trojan prince who escaped the Greeks' destruction of his city, carrying his father on his back in that famous scene everyone's seen in art. Here's how the legend went. After years wandering the Mediterranean, Aeneas landed in Italy. He married the local king's daughter, Lavinia, and their descendants eventually produced Romulus. That made every Roman essentially part Trojan, giving them roots as deep as any Greek cities. Convenient timing too. Just as Rome was expanding into Greek-influenced southern Italy, they could claim equal mythological pedigree. Virgil's Aeneid would later polish this tale into a masterpiece, but the basics were circulating long before him. Roman diplomats in the 200s BC already referenced their Trojan ancestry when negotiating with Greek cities. Coins minted in the hundreds BC showed Aeneas carrying his father Anchises. The story stuck because it served multiple purposes at once. For one, it explained Rome's rocky start. Why were early Romans so warlike? Because they inherited Trojan resilience after losing their homeland. Why were they always wrestling with neighbors? Because founding heroes like Romulus fought to establish their place. The myth transformed random violence into part of a grand narrative. The divine connections were equally useful. Aeneas was supposedly the son of Venus, Aphrodite to Greeks, making Julius Caesar's claim of descent from her somewhat plausible. Suddenly, Roman emperors weren't just politicians. They had literal goddess blood in their veins. Religious rituals tied to Aeneas pop up in archaeological finds, like a 4th century BC shrine near Lavinium, where priests reenacted his landing. Not everyone bought it. Some Greek historians like Dionysius of Halicarnassus openly questioned the timeline. Troy fell centuries before Rome existed. Roman traditionalists clung to the Romulus story, leaving the literary elite to smooth over contradictions. The pragmatic answer? Keep both. The twins gave Rome a dramatic founding moment. Aeneas provided ancient roots. The myth also justified expansion. Aeneas was fated by the gods to settle Italy. Therefore, Roman conquests were destiny, not aggression. When they took over Greek cities in the south, they could frame it as a homecoming of sorts. Allies like the Etruscans got woven into the narrative too. Their legends about Trojan refugees provided common ground. Art became propaganda. Wealthy families commissioned ancestral portraits showing supposed Trojan forebears. Public friezes depicted Aeneas's journey alongside Rome's actual military victories. The message was clear: our past is as glorious as our present. There's an irony in Rome aping Greek culture to assert independence. Their national epic mimicked Homer's style. Their claimed ancestor was a Greek enemy. Even the Aeneid was written in Latin but stuffed with Greek literary devices. It's like building a mansion and decorating it entirely with items from your rival's estate sale. The legend's flexibility helped it last. When Rome needed to explain its multi-ethnic empire, Aeneas became the prototype immigrant who assimilated. During civil wars, factions claimed his moral legacy. Augustus later used it to justify his rule. Virgil paints Aeneas as the original self-sacrificing leader, a clear parallel to the emperor. Archaeology suggests how the story spread. Cheap oil lamps with Aeneas motifs turn up in working-class neighborhoods. Children's pottery shards show doodles of the Trojan horse. The state didn't just impose this myth from above. Ordinary Romans made it part of daily life. Did they truly believe? Probably as much as any culture believes its founding legends. The practical benefits outweighed skepticism. When an Etruscan envoy questioned Rome's Trojan claims in 280 BC, the Senate simply sent back a list of recent Roman victories. Myth mattered, but power mattered more. By 300 BC, the pieces were aligning. Rome had military might, strategic colonies, and now a backstory to match its ambitions. The Aeneas myth gave them cultural confidence when dealing with older civilizations. Where Greeks saw barbarians, Romans could point to their epic ancestry. But legends don't win battles alone. The next threats would test Rome's actual strength, not its mythology. The Samnites in the mountains weren't impressed by Trojan pedigrees, and looming beyond them were the Gauls again, ready to see if Rome's new walls could back up its fancy origin story. The myth's real power wasn't in competing with Greece, it was uniting Romans themselves. A shared past helped blend Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan traditions into one identity. When a soldier from a backwater colony said he descended from Aeneas, he wasn't lying in the strictest sense. He was claiming membership in Rome's story. That story kept growing. Centuries later, when Rome actually conquered Greece, they'd joke about settling an old family quarrel. The Trojans would finally have their revenge through Roman spears. History became legend, legend became justification, and justification paved the way for empire. Now, with their origin myth firmly in place, Rome faced its next challenge, proving that legacy wasn't just talk. The rebuilt military, the colonies, the walls, all needed to hold against enemies who didn't care about poetic traditions. The coming century would show whether Rome could live up to the epic it had created for itself. The Gallic sack should have destroyed Rome. Instead, it became their turning point. That humiliating defeat, the burning, the ransom, the broken pride, forced changes that created an empire. The Servian walls rose from the ashes. The legions reformed into something deadly. Rome learned to turn disaster into strength. Now I want to hear from you. What shocked you most about their comeback? The way they rebuilt their entire military system? How they turned conquered enemies into loyal allies? Or maybe just that they managed to make geese into war heroes? Drop your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this trip through Rome's darkest and most pivotal hour, give the video a like. It helps more than you'd think.